fragmented
Now
market
we have heads
will
of state
further
arriving
weaken
at the
global
venue
economy.
of the G20. This is Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy has already arrived at the venue of the International Convention Center in Hangzhou. This is the live shot from the venue convention center. This is the Hangzhou city will work together with all the G20 members towards an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive growth. This is Thai Prime Minister. And we just saw Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. Now is the Thai Prime Minister, who's just arrived at the summit. And Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong from Singapore has showed up at the International Convention Center. Singapore is not a G20 member country, but is invited by Chinese president to show up. And Singapore is a very important nation economy. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong just arrived. He was sworn in office in 2004. Of course, we all know his father's Lee Kuan Yew. And this is Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister. This is Trudeau's first visit to China since he took office last year. Besides Hangzhou, Trudeau's tour also includes stops in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong SAR. We all know his father initiated the diplomatic ties establishment with China together with Premier Zhou Enlai back then. And Trudeau said on his trip he would strive for a closer, more balanced relationship between Canada and China, which can unlock the untapped close. Now we have Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from Japan. Abe said China, South Korea, and Japan account for 1/4 of the global economy. That's why it is important for the cooperation among South Korea, Japan, and China. And now we have European Council President Donald Tusk. European Union is a member of G20 as one economic entity. European Council is a strategic body that provides the Union with general political directions and priorities and act as a collective presidency. And China is the second trading partner of the EU. Trade volume reached 500 billion euros back in 2015. And now we have President Idriss Déby of Chad. President Déby has been invited to the G20 Summit as the current chair of the African Union. The Africa's fifth largest country is rich in gold and uranium and stands to benefit from its recently acquired status as oil exporting state. To revive its economy, Chad's government has been trying to improve its business environment. Now we have Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. But this is Turnbull's second visit to China since he took office in 2015. During his visit to China earlier, Turnbull led a delegation of 2,000 business people in a bid to expand business cooperation between the two. And both signed memorandums of understanding on sport and tourism. And China is Australia's biggest trading partner with an annual trade worth more than $110 billion over the last 2 years. And we have another European representative, Juncker, Mr. Juncker, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. But the European Commission is the executive body of the EU. It is responsible for proposing legislation, implementing decisions making, upholding the EU treaties, and managing the day-to-day business of the EU. The Commissioner of EU stressed that the combined economies of EU and China account for 1/3 of global output. That shows how important Europe is to China. He also said bilateral trade had grown substantially, and China is playing an important and constructive role at a global level in the context of G20. And now we have Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi coming to the convention center, and this is the Renzi's second visit since he took office in 2014. He took office, he was only 39. Italy was hit by earthquake last month, killed 300 people. But the international community has been showing great sympathy towards Italy during the earthquake. And now we have President Bongyan Virachit of Laos. Laos is the ASEAN chair for 2016. Lao President Virachit represents the organization of the Southeast Asian nations at the G20 Summit. But the 10 member states account for nearly 1/10 of the world's population. The combined ASEAN GDP in 2015 makes it the world's 5th largest economy, worth nearly $3 trillion. Well, this year marks the 25th anniversary of dialogue between China and ASEAN. Now we have Brazilian President Michel Temer. He just resumed his office several days ago. But Temer is now the Brazilian president after the Senate voted on August 31st for the parliamentary removal of the former President Dilma Rousseff. Temer says he would take the opportunity of the G20 summit, improve his country's image, and he says universality in terms of foreign policy is very important. And now we have Mr. Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's president is paying a 5-day working visit to China, began on Thursday. Since President Xi took office, he has paid 2 state visits to the Central Asian countries. During his visit to Kazakhstan in 2013, Mr. Xi raised the idea of One Belt, One Road, Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative. And now we have President of Senegal, Macky Sall. Well, Senegal is a core member of the Economic Community of West African States. The country is now coordinating an economic development program within the African Union. Ahead of the summit, Senegal's Commerce Minister said that he believes the summit will be a great chance for Senegal to represent the African nations and help draw attention to the concerns over development. And we have President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi from Egypt. It is the first time that Egypt has ever joined in the G20 summit. But experts believe the country's participation as guest of honor will help its economy and attract more investment. It is also an opportunity to boost Egyptian-Chinese economic partnership. The two countries have been enjoying strong ties, and this year marks the 60th anniversary of the establishment of ties. Egypt was the first Arab state to establish diplomatic relations with China. And now we have Argentine President Mauricio Macri. Well, this is his first visit to China since taking office in 2015. Argentina is bidding for the host country of the G20 summit. The Argentine government says this is a very important goal for their foreign policy. Well, the Argentine Chamber of Commerce says a little over 73% of the country's trade is with G20 countries. And Argentina is one of the world's leading agri-food producers. As one of the Latin American members of G20, Argentina looks to take the chance to deepen South-South cooperation at the G20 summit. And we have now another motorcade arriving at the International Convention Center, the main venue for the G20 summit in Hangzhou, a very magnificent building over there. And now we have Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Mexico hosted the 7th G20 in Los Cabos town in 2012. During that summit, G20 members agreed to contribute over $450 billion to the IMF in order to help the global effort overcome the financial crises. And an action plan to strengthen the fiscal and monetary policy was also delivered at that summit. Mexico and China have an opportunity to take one step forward in agricultural cooperation at the summit in Hangzhou. And now we have Indonesian President Joko Widodo coming over to the summit. This is Widodo's third visit to China as president. His last visit was in 2015, when he also attended the Boao Forum for Asia. Indonesia is the only country in ASEAN to be included in the G20. But the country's GDP growth is roughly 5% in 2015, ranking third among all the G20 members. According to Indonesia's Investment Coordination Board, the country has gained over $1 billion of foreign direct investment from China. That's a 500% increase from last year. And industries, says China and Indonesia, have common interests and similar positions in strengthening economic cooperation. Another motorcade is streaming in front of the International Convention Center, representing South Africa. This is Jacob Zuma, President Jacob Zuma. And actually, this is the fifth time Zuma visited China since he took office in 2009. As the only African member of the G20, South Africa is expected to raise issues on weak economic growth, terrorism, and underdevelopment, which affect Africa and the global South. South African officials say the summit would take place as the world is facing sluggish growth, with some countries like South Africa facing downgrades by rating agencies. But the country is also a member of the BRICS group of 5 emerging economies. The other 4 members, of course, Brazil, China, India, Russia. And South Africa joined the group in 2010. The BRICS summit is now routinely held in the sidelines of the G20 summit. And this morning, President Xi attended the BRICS summit. Another motorcade showing up. This time we have the French delegation arriving. This is Hollande's third visit to China since he took office 4 years ago. France has been hit hard by terror attacks in recent months. In July, 86 people were killed and more than 300 wounded in the southern city of Nice. At this year's G20, Hollande is expected to talk about issues like counterterrorism and refugee crisis. Well, France is the first Western country to establish diplomatic relations with China. Paris is also the major Western power, established a comprehensive strategic partnership with Beijing. Both countries are expected to further promote bilateral relations at the G20 summit. But next year, we'll probably expect another presidential election in France. And France, we understand, hosted the G20 summit back in 2011. In nuclear energy, aviation, France and China have a lot to join hands with. And also, China is looking at France to internationalize its currency, maybe as a hub for the yuan businesses. And people in Hangzhou lining up the streets to welcome the delegations of foreign dignitaries arriving. We understand that Hangzhou is well known for West Lake. That's why the motorcades have been carrying the dignitaries, carrying over the bridge, and then coming down to the other side of the Qiantang River where the International Expo Center has been. This city has a 5,000-year history. That's why it has a robust history and culture, and that's something that can serve the dignitaries very well. And we have German Chancellor Angela Merkel. This is Merkel's 10th visit to China since she took office in 2005. 10 visits to China, that's more than anyone in the West. The number shows how close China and Germany have become in the past decade. Actually, over the years, Germany remained China's biggest trading partner within the EU. Trade volume close to that of Britain, France, and Italy combined. Germany's strong economic performance makes growth rate a lesser concern for Merkel, but her frustration comes from the ongoing refugee crisis. Well, Berlin has been one of the major advocates in the European Union to accept more and more of refugees, but a deteriorating security in the country and culture clashes probably has posed severe challenges to that policy and her political future. As leaders of the world's major economies gather in Hangzhou, the summit is an opportunity for Merkel to talk about the relations between Germany and China. We have another motorcade arriving, representing the Republic of Korea. All the ladies are coming. South Korea's capital Seoul hosted the 5th G20 Summit in 2010. And now President Park Geun-hye has arrived. At that meeting, leaders agreed to develop guidelines for addressing huge current account imbalances. Of course, South Korea is also a member of the OECD and a founding member of APEC and East Asia Summit. For the first time in G20 history, this year's Hangzhou Summit will be adding innovation as a topic for discussions. The South Korean experts say China is the engine for economic development in Asia, as it contributes 30 to 50% to the continent's economic growth. But of course, China and South Korea have been at odds over the deployment of THAAD anti-missile system recently. That could be a complicating factor. The report measures of national innovation competitiveness of 19 G20 economies are based on their performance in 5 major innovation areas comprised of foundation, environment, input, output, and sustainability. And now we have Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The last time he was in China was for state visit in May. Well, Economic Affairs Ministers of India says the country's focus of the G20 will be on global structural reforms to generate more jobs and spur inclusive growth. Well, India could ask for G20 members to bring more investment to the country and make good use of its manpower. Well, India is a founding member of the BRICS groups of the 5 emerging economies. In a China-India financial dialogue in August, the 2 countries agreed to increase dialogue and cooperate within the G20 framework. They also agreed to build platforms for financial interactions for fully using the AIIB, the BRICS Development Bank, and the BRICS Contingency Reserve Arrangement to enhance cooperation. You're now watching the live broadcast of the G20 Summit in Hangzhou, and this year there are 4 keywords that all start with the letter I for this year's summit in Hangzhou. That's innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive. Each of them have their own meaning. Of course, innovation comes first, and that's what President Xi mentioned at the opening of the B20 meeting yesterday. That's the world needs more innovation to sustain growth. And growth is what the world economy has been asking for, because sluggish growth has been the major problem and challenge the whole world has been facing. And that's why the G20 leaders need to talk about how to bring the world out of sluggish growth with some actions. And China hopes the G20 members will enhance the reform of the international financial institution as well, improve the monetary system, and strengthen financial cooperation. We have another delegation arriving at the venue at the International Convention Center. This is the Turkey delegation, represented by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This is Erdogan's second visit to China as president. Last year's G20 summit was held in Antalya province in Turkey. It reflected a strong emphasis on inclusivity and developmental issues on sustained development goals, energy access, climate change, and refugee crises. And for the first time in the G20 history, Hangzhou Summit will add innovation. President Erdogan said Turkey was an important site on Asian Silk Road. Turkey is a supporter of China's Belt and Road Initiative. He expressed hopes that Turkey and China can deepen their cooperation under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. And political analysts and foreign affairs experts say the country of Turkey is facing many challenges, including, of course, domestic politics, Turkish-Russian ties, terrorism, the Syrian civil war, refugee crises. Turkey says it hopes to take the chance to try to resolve some diplomatic issues through bilateral and multilateral meeting at the G20 summit. We understand in the Antalya summit in G20, there is a strong focus on inclusivity and sustainable development. And this is carried on at the Hangzhou summit, this time in Hangzhou. And for the first time, the G20 report will measure the national innovation competitiveness of all the different G20 economies based on their performance in major innovation that will comprise the foundation, environment, input, and output. The Group of 20 is an international forum, we understand, for the world's largest economies. The group was established at the G7 finance ministers meeting in 1999, and founded with the aim of promoting high-level talks aimed at international finance and economic growth. And the inaugural meeting was held later that year in Berlin. Following that, ministers and central bank governors from the G20 members gather every year with the response to the 2008 financial crisis. The G20 was elevated to the leaders level and had its first airing in Washington, D.C. in 2008. And the summit brings together heads of state of government, in addition to members, finance ministers, and central bank governors. What will happen then is President Xi will meet the G20 economy leaders at the front gate, and they will have a front group photo inside the building. And then they will go to the fourth floor where the summit meeting will take place. You're now looking at the convention center, the venue for the G20 summit in Hangzhou. In a distance, we're expecting more G20 economy leaders to descend on this venue very soon. Well, as I just mentioned, different countries have their different agendas at this year's G20 summit. The problem is, how can they align their interests and agendas? They have different priorities. Do you think they will come down and have a sober talks and come up with a rational plan?
Well, I'm sure there's going to be sober talks, which is good news. G20 leaders, after all, as Mr. Zhang said, it present 80% of global GDP. And I think the good news is that they actually do reforms, 150 major ones since 2008. At the same time, whenever they come back home, they raise trade barriers. So I think there is...
And also political blowbacks within their country.
Yeah, so to me, sometimes G20 looks like it's preventing the worst.
Preventing the worst.
Yes.
Hoping for the best.
And hoping for the best, but not necessarily really restructuring the world economies. And it's a good communication platform, but we have to put it in perspective. Everybody's facing domestic challenges.
And what do you think the most difficult challenge the G20 country faced?
I think is slowing economy. It really is a lack of demand globally. It is the urge by domestic constituencies to raise protectionism. As Mr. Zhang said, the US elections are vital. Neither of the candidates has spoken up for globalization.
Maybe different signals will be sent
So
out.
I think it's actually, we're in a phase of bad news for globalization.
We have the arrival of another delegation coming to the convention center representing Saudi Arabia. That's Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman representing Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia's Deputy Crown acts as Saudi Arabia's current Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister. And Saudi Arabia is the only Arab country in the G20, making it an important party in the Middle East, as well as major power in the international energy sector. But China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. Saudi Arabia is China's largest energy supplier, as well as largest trading partner in the Middle East and Africa. Trade volume between the two countries reached $51 billion back in 2015. And during Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia, January this year, the two sides agreed to build comprehensive strategic partnership. Meanwhile, the meeting between Intergovernmental Joint Committee between China and Saudi Arabia has been held recently. It represents the relations between the two have reached a new milestone. Now we have another delegation arriving, apparently a very large one. Looking at the motorcade, it seems it's the United States delegation. This will probably be President Obama's last visit to Asia as President of the United States. And it's the third visit to China, his 11th trip to Asia. Things he took office in 2009. He championed a policy of rebalancing to Asia, which is very controversial in Asia. But the U.S. is the largest economy, of course, in G20. And it has hosted two summits in 2008 and 2009. That's probably why the G20 mechanism began to take shape. The White House said Obama will hold talks with President Xi. Actually, they did, and the two world leaders talked about a lot of range of issues. The White House added that Obama's trip will highlight the president's commitment to the G20 as the premium forum for economic cooperation, as well as the U.S. rebalance of Asia Pacific. 2016 marks Obama's final G20 appearance as U.S. president. As we understand, there is a presidential election. The result will be known in November, and that will probably decide the direction of U.S. under the leadership of the new president. And now we have the delegation of the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Theresa May. This is May's first visit to China since replacing David Cameron as the new leader of the UK following the controversial Brexit. She's wearing all red, very promising color for Theresa May. Maybe she shows some confidence for the G20 mechanism. Hopefully it will work even after Brexit.